Joe, welcome back to the Way of Champions.
I'm pleased to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Well, I'm so pleased that we get to have you here to talk about your new book, The Tyranny of Talent: How It Compels and Limits Athletic Achievement and Why You Should Ignore It. There's a lot in that title right there.
There is, you got to be a bit provocative. Yeah, I don't, yeah, you can decide whether I meet the expectations of that title or not, but it was certainly a bold one.
Yeah. Oh, well, let me ask you because people ask me this all the time. Did you come up with the title? Like the title is always the last thing I come up with. Was it for you as well?
It was definitely after the first draft of the book was done. I knew I wanted to write about talent in some form, but there were a couple of other titles that were in the running. And then when came across that one, it just was one of those eureka moments in the shower, I think, and it was like, oh yeah, that's it, because that does capture the way that I think the sport world thinks about talent. It does have a bit of a tyrannical hold over a lot of things that we do and coaches do.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you, the word tyranny. So just sort of how it sort of has this authoritarian grip on everything that we do.
Yeah, it's whether it's implicit in the way that coaches think about their athletes or really explicit, like the way we design athlete development systems that try to stream kids as early as possible. Well, that you're thinking about talent in a specific way that's controlling something that should be a little bit more adaptable and flexible.
Yeah.
And so that's what I was trying to capture in that title.
And you've been doing research in this area and I do your bio offline. So, but I mean, you've done so much research in this area of skill acquisition and expertise and obviously, how we coach and teaching and specialization and all that. But it was all kind of leading you to this idea because you and I have talked many times on this idea of talent, and it's certainly a word that we throw out all the time without really knowing, well, what is talent? Is talent, what I see? Well, maybe that's just
Mhm.
ability, right? And what else goes into it? So what is your working definition of talent?
Yeah, it's interesting that you're right. Talent is that sort of global glue that holds all of our research topics that we've looked at over the last 20 plus years. It's the one that is the thread that weaves them all together. For me, I think we have to make a distinction between what talent is as a research concept, which is this kind of global idea that there are differences between people that are going to matter in terms of their likelihood of success. Height is the most obvious example. If your predicted adult height is 7 feet, you've got an advantage over somebody who's going to be 5 feet.
Mm-hmm.
In sports where height matters, if shorter people matter, then the person with the shorter stature has an advantage. Those differences are there in the human population, and sometimes those differences matter. For me, that's a defendable idea from a research perspective. From a practical perspective, if you go and tell a coach, I want you to go and assess things that are going to be predictive of long-term success in your sport, I would say don't do that because the research doesn't support that kind of use of that concept in that practical way.
Mm-hmm.
If you do it, you're probably doing more harm than good because your assessments are almost always too simple. They don't capture the complexity of humans and how they develop over time. They don't capture the sophistication of the environments we can put people in. And so, when at all possible, coaches and parents and administrators shouldn't do that. But the reality is, we live in a resource limited system in sport, and we have to do that because we don't have the resources to keep everyone.
Right, right. And that's what's fascinating about it is it's not, and maybe just a good place to start in this idea of nature versus nurture, right? And so there is a nature piece to it and there's a nurture piece to it, and they don't exist in a bubble.
Right.
They exist together. And so you could have all the nature pieces, and if you are born in, sub-Saharan Africa, you're probably not going to be a figure skater.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, the analogy when I was a grad student, the analogy that I really liked was this idea that It was called the bucket analogy, that your genes tell you the size of the bucket and your environment tells you how much water goes into it,
Hmm.
which I learned is actually a too simple a way to think about the way that genes and environment interact, and that a better one is what's called the rectangle analogy, which is trying to determine the proportion of a person's development or their success or their performance that's related to genes versus environment, is like trying to figure out whether the area of a rectangle is related to its length or its width.
Hmm.
You can't separate it. Those
Hmm.
things are impossible to discern which impacts what. That's a better reflection of how genes and environments interact. You go through environments from your first day on this planet, that's going to affect the types of genes that are switched on and off, type of learning that occurs, the type of experience that we have. And that's the beauty of us as a species, is this plasticity that we have to adapt to different environments.
Hmm.
And that starts at day one. That doesn't mean that talent doesn't matter. It just means
Hmm.
that after day one, we have an impossible job of separating experience and learning from genetic raw material that person had when they started.
Hmm. Hmm. And so you kind of start and you talk about, I mean, I think we had, I think it was 19th century, this whole idea
Mm.
of it's all nature, right? And certainly in, let's call it the late 20th century, early 21st, we had it's all nurture, and you're sort of trying to bring it
Yeah.
back to the middle, right? And each idea was very popular in their own time, because when you put everything in one bucket, it's going to really resonate with a few people who happen to have that bucket.
Yeah, and you could be forgiven by, assuming that it's just been this sort of seesaw that goes back and forth between nature and nurture. I actually am a bit more optimistic in terms of what researchers have provided us with, because
Hmm.
I started out as a deliberate practice guy, and that was my area of research for almost 10 years.
Hmm.
And I still like that framework. I still use it. I just position talent in a different way relative to it. And so, we look at questions related to why would someone choose to do, to use an overworked cliche, why would they put in 10,000 hours of sometimes really boring, monotonous training? Well, maybe they had a talent to do that. Maybe
Hmm.
they had a personality that wired them in a way to enjoy that more than another person would. Well, if
Yeah.
they did, then that could be an indicator of talent. Talent isn't always physical. It isn't always related to performance. Sometimes it's
Hmm.
related to behavior.
And I think that's so important to just say that again, because I think of this in terms of the swimmer who's just going to sit
Mm,
there and stare at the bottom of the pool for 4 hours a day
yeah.
for year after year after year. I mean, I also am good friends with a former Olympic gold medalist who hasn't been in a pool since.
Mhm.
So he'd seen enough of the pool bottom,
Yeah.
right? And so, but you have to have a certain talent to do those laps and put in that work, and you can't become an elite swimmer without it. By the same token, someone else might not have that desire, let's just, that talent, right, to do
Yeah.
that. And so a different sport, a different activity is going to be a far better fit for them.
Yeah, I think that's the important message, is the sport is such an amazing area of human endeavor that you could probably, if you knew a person well enough, you could find a sport that fits for their interests, for their skill set, for their desires, for what they enjoy doing, which means that we should, as much as we can, limit the extent to which the system takes those options and opportunities away from people.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons I'm against early streaming, except for extreme cases where we know without a doubt that this person is, the Tiger Woods example. Tiger Woods wanted to be a golfer, and if you took him out of golf to put him in another activity, he probably wouldn't have enjoyed it as much.
Right.
Most kids are not Tiger Woods. Most
Right.
kids need to be exposed to as many opportunities as we can provide them with, and let them have agency over where they decide. Let them have a bit of control over what they're doing, things that they like to do. The talented ones will find the sport that they're best suited for, and the flip side of that is everyone else is going to get a more positive experience out of their sport journey as well.
Yeah, and I think that's what gets missed about Tiger Woods. Never mind that, right? He's a unicorn in a
Yeah.
way, right?
Yeah.
That a lot of things went his way, and he had the genetics and the drive and the access to golf, to coaching a certain way. Like he talks a lot about when he was a young kid, his golf coach who just used to go, they used to just go play.
Hmm.
Right. And he would just compete, and he learned through playing and course management, not just sitting on a range working on his swing. So a lot of things went his way. And yeah, and that was his fit. And he talks about, it
Yeah.
wasn't my dad, it was me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's for me, I think that's such a powerful message, not in support of the Tiger Woods model for everyone, but for some people, that is the perfect fit for them.
Hmm.
So, we need to figure out how do we deliver that to the child who's obsessed, to the prodigy that wants to be the best at golf or rowing or running or whatever it ends up being. How do we deliver that sport experience in a way that manages all these things related to the risk of specializing in one activity over another? How do we make sure they develop fundamental movement skills and long-term enjoyment, intrinsic motivation, all that kind of stuff?
Mm.
We got to start with, hey, there's no one size fits all model here that's going to capture all your athletes.
Right. And I think our issue is, as a society, is that we try to create the one size fits all, and the size that we create is the one to find the next tiger. And we find the one tiger, and then the other 99 quit, or they were in the wrong thing and whatever, and we say, oh, but look, we found tiger. And maybe let's, that's a model that, maybe is okay for communist China, and their
Mhm.
definition of success is, but we found
Yeah.
one. But I don't think that's our Western world definition of a successful sporting system.
No, I don't think it can be because, when you have unlimited numbers of athletes that you can grind through your system, you can have a system that's effective but not
Hmm.
very efficient.
Hmm.
In North American sports and most Western European sports, you have to have an efficient system because your population of athletes is not unlimited.
Hmm.
For me, I think that's a more important distinction between the sort of the Chinese system, the communist system, and the Western system, is this effectiveness versus efficiency argument.
Yeah, and the smaller your country, the lower your population, the more efficient it needs to be, and the more trading across sports and stuff. Like the kid who doesn't cut it at soccer, you have to send to someone else, not just say, "Yep, you're not going to make it in soccer."
Correct. Yeah, and a couple of the sports that we've worked with over the past year in different countries, it's interesting because we always think of the North American athlete development pyramid where that's this big broad base of support. Most sports in a lot of smaller countries, they don't have a pyramid, they have a silo. They can't let anybody leave their pathway, because
Mm.
if they do, then that's a really inefficient management for their system.
Hmm. Whew. So many ways we could go here. Let's talk nurture, right? We
Sure.
swung, we certainly swung with the bounces and the outliers and the talent is overrated type books to the nurture side of things. And you've always been very, very clear that um, the greatest thing that you control is the amount of practice you do,
Yeah.
right? So that you own your practice, and that's a big determinant in how you're going to do at something. But it's also not the only determinant that maybe some of these books turned it into.
Right. I still stand by that conclusion. I think even after the last 10 years of work in talent, that I still tell coaches that the number one thing that you can do for your athlete is to provide them with the best learning environment possible, and so that they can rack up those hours of deliberate practice. I still think that's a positive and empowering message. The problem though is when we assume that's the only thing that explains a person's success, because
Mhm.
people don't start at the same place. The playing field isn't level for people, and so there are some people that are going to start with big advantages. How do we improve the system to identify that so we can build structures into place to help remove disadvantages from people, socioeconomic status, relative age, those kinds of things that have persistent biases we've seen in our system for decades.
Mhm.
When you emphasize the value of deliberate practice and high quality training, you make those biases even more important because they're the things that limit a person's access to that high quality training.
Mhm. Right. Because I mean, and it starts at these very young ages. If you don't get in the door, right? And then oftentimes what the things that limit you getting in the door or are a December birthday as opposed to a January birthday. I mean, I have a friend whose son was born at like 10:30 p.m. on December 31st. And he's like, my son's life would be so different if
Yeah.
he was born an hour and a half later, at
Yeah.
least in sports. And it's so true.
It is, and it's such a and it's an easy mechanism. We know exactly what it is,
Yeah.
but since 1984, 1985, this phenomenon has persisted, and it hasn't gotten any better. And if anything, it's gotten worse in a lot of sports. That's For me, that's the problem that we have with sport as a system for athlete development.
And we know it. I was just listening to a podcast the other day of a researcher who had looked at all of the um U17, 19, and senior level European championships in soccer. And it's just the younger you are, the more the relative age effect is there. Not as prevalent in girls, but I think that's just because girls hit puberty sooner. So when we're actually trying to identify these kids at 17 or 18, they've already grown, where a 16-year-old boy, for many of them, has a lot of growing left to do.
Yeah, and we know the solution to that is to remove and we probably can use what we see in the women's game as pointing the direction to that solution, which is delay selection until after that period of biological maturation.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. So what are some of these other effects? Because again, this is why this is such a fascinating concept. We have the genetic effect, we have the nurture effect, not only practice, but we have then environment, right? And then we have genetically, can you cope with the environment that it takes, aka the swimming example,
Yeah,
and the 7 foot tall example. So there's so many variables. Should we even have talent development systems? Because they seem to exclude more than they develop.
they do. And I don't know if I think I say this in the book somewhere, but like you'd be forgiven if you just threw your hands up in the air and said, this is just a complete mess. We're never going to fix it. So, and we can't predict it. So, what can I do? But at the same time, that's not the solution either, because
Mhm.
we know that if we take coaches and we have them design, environments that are optimized for the learning needs of the athletes in them, we can help them develop better skills. We can help them move faster into their progression to high performance. So we know that we have things that work, and so it's hopefully the message in the book is not, this is way too complicated, we shouldn't try to do anything, because that's certainly not my message. I'm really empowered by what we see in skill acquisition research to tell us about how we try to mitigate some of these big biases without having to tear down the entire sports system and design something new. There are lessons that we can learn from different countries, the way different sports have done things, to help us make maybe small changes that are feasible in the system that we have, that are going to end up having big effects in the long run.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think about this, you talked about the learning needs of athletes. So what are those things, right? And that's ownership, and
Mm,
that's enjoyment. And oftentimes I think in these development systems, we only talk about competency,
yeah.
right? And so we design a whole, and I work with so many organizations like this. I'm like, your whole thing is designed for improving competency, but where's your work on belonging? Where's your work
Yeah.
on decision making and agency for the children, or they're just a bunch of little robots running around there, and you're saying, look how competent they are, and I'm saying I haven't seen a smile in an hour and a half.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's probably more relevant at the lower levels of the pathway where people don't know what how to measure their own competence. The social comparison doesn't emerge until a little bit later in childhood. And so we've got to be designing our sport programs to meet different kinds of basic needs that they have. Enjoyment, I think, is the most powerful motivator we have about human behavior, but that doesn't mean enjoyment's the same for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting you raise the point around I haven't seen a smile in an hour, because I get this feedback from my wife all the time that you're listening to these people and you're frowning, and cognitive effort actually makes your face frown. It doesn't make your face go into a smile. And so
Right.
I'd say I'm attentively listening to this person.
That's interesting.
And so like for me, I think with kids, it's too simple to say just go out and count the number of smiles,
Mm-hmm.
because no, the ones that are there actually learning, engaged in the process, might not be smiling. That doesn't mean they're not enjoying it. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think we have to pay more attention to this variable, which is often, it's thrown into these kinds of discussions. Make sure they're having fun, make sure they're enjoying it. That doesn't mean enjoyment's the same for everyone. Some people are going to be getting a lot of enjoyment out of hard work that's monotonous, and the average person would say, I'm not going to do that. Your
Mm-hmm.
elite performer might want to do that as a just something that maybe they're wired to do.
Yeah. And I think you can, I'm glad you said that, because I think that's a really important point. Because I think you can also, I know kids have enjoyed a practice even if they're frowning the whole time. And
Mm,
when you blow the final whistle and say, we're done, they're like, wait, that's it.
yeah.
Right. Because they're in flow, it flew by. Like they were doing the hard work and they were very present and in the moment, but it was engaging and challenging and all
Yeah.
these things. And that's it. Like that's when you're okay, I nailed that one. That was good.
I think for me, what I'd like to see, and this isn't our area of specialization, but the if we go with the three basic needs from self-determination theory: autonomy, belongingness, competence, you might see more smiles, more sort of obvious signs of enjoyment with people that are there for autonomy and belongingness, and competency might actually look like it's less fun,
Mm.
but it's because the person is motivated for different outcomes.
Hmm. But I think this is where, as a coach, as the facilitator of this, you check in,
Yeah.
right? Joe, how's it going? It's good, coach. That was a hard day. Sweet.
Yeah.
Right. I can check in, and that's where connection, and I think belongingness is not just child with team, but connection to the coach or who's ever doing this is coach sees me, coach cares about me, coach has
Yeah.
my best interest in mind. I can grind, and coaches and I know coach cares, right? I can have a tough day and I know coach cares. And if coach cares, I'm going to feel more belonging.
And when we're talking about young athletes and the importance of significant others, that coach athlete connection is probably the more important one than the athlete connection,
Mm-hmm.
because that significant other is so important to that young athlete.
Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, the autonomy piece as well, I think is so important, just from the standpoint of if we're truly, quote, developing talent, end quote, right? Then the ability of that athlete to think for him or herself, to have intelligence about the game and understanding and intuition of what's happening, all that intelligence can't just be on the sideline. And so that ability for them to make decisions, for them to have a voice, for them to answer questions that are challenging, for them to be challenged, that's absolutely huge. You have to create that in your environments as well.
I think it's also one of those variables we don't really understand how that perceptions of autonomy and personal agency change over the athlete pathway,
Mm,
because there's a lot of stories of athletes at the high performance level that they don't want to actually think about the minutia of decision making, in how their world is structured, because they know if they give that to someone else, person's going to make the right decisions. I can let my coach design practice because I trust that they're going to do the right thing.
Mhm.
So this, as much as agency and autonomy is this basic need of human motivation, I think it's autonomy at the right time, not autonomy in general.
Not
And so
for
that's a
autonomy's sake, but yeah, yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. So it's when autonomy matters, I feel like I have autonomy, is a really neat concept that I haven't seen explored that much in high performance sport.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I heard this quote on a show I was watching with my wife the other day, and I'm going to get it wrong, but it's kind of along this line. It's like, you know, when talking, this is a dad talking about his child, and he says, "When I get scared and worried, that's when I treat you like a child." And when
Yeah.
when I'm not, that's when I treat you like an adult. And I thought about that from my own perspective. I have a daughter who just turned 17 and whatever, and it's like, yeah, you know what? When I'm not worried, the adult, it just snowed out. I'm going to treat you like a child when you're getting in that car to drive. you know?
Yeah, it's interesting. We're all two steps away from, animals in the savannah that have these hardwired emotional responses to uncertainty and danger. And I think, there's something to be said for recognizing even a coach athlete relationship, everything could be going fantastically until a point of crisis. What's the response during that period? That's one of the
Mhm.
things we're looking at in our self-regulation work at the moment, is not self-regulation all the time, but self-regulation when you're challenged, when you're in a period of optimal learning because of optimized challenge.
Mhm.
Then how do you self-regulate?
Mhm.
For me, that's a slightly different question, but maybe a more important one for understanding why some people thrive and some people don't.
It's interesting. We're recording this, and I'm a big soccer guy, and the World Cup is on, and I just finished right before we got on watching Portugal play Switzerland, and Portugal won 5-1. And since this is coming out 2 days later, if you hadn't watched the game yet, that's your problem at this point, right? But there was a big controversy because the coach of Portugal benched Cristiano Ronaldo, first time he's ever benched him, right?
Mm,
Because of his reaction to being subbed the other day. Right. So now we have this outcome bias of, if it worked out, it was brilliant coaching. And if it doesn't work out, it's horrible coaching. Right. So if they lost today, what a terrible decision. How could you do that? You disrupted your team. Well, the guy he put in his fourth game ever for Portugal scored 3 goals today.
yeah.
Right. So brilliant decision, great coaching. And now how does Ronaldo react to that? Can you expect to be back in the lineup the next game? You acted like a baby. The coach made a decision. The guy who took your place just stepped up in a big way. What's your expectation moving forward? And I think that's really interesting.
Well, it'll be interesting to see the next game because, having a player like Ronaldo and not playing him in the next round would be, that's a very bold message that you're putting down there. I think the statistician in me says how much of that replacement player's performance is going to be regression to the mean, right? Like we just saw,
Right.
3 goals a game is not the expectation for that player. So, let's keep our feet on planet Earth here. And you've got one of the greatest players of all time sitting on the bench. I
Yeah.
think he's
No.
learned his lesson.
But I mean, let's just wrap that in without dissecting the decision anymore and saying, isn't talent also, again, not just what we see, but these psychological characteristics
Mm.
and becoming a good teammate and making the people around you better? And is Ronaldo's talent, I mean, maybe this is my question for you that I've just making up on the spot, is his talent diminishing, not so much physically, but because of his expectation to be the center of everything when he's not anymore, and he doesn't have the coping skills to deal with it at Manchester United with Portugal?
It's interesting. We're working on a project right now with some skill acquisition specialists that work in professional sport, and it's amazing how little we know about the development of players once they make it to that elite level. We've
Mm.
got all kinds of research looking at the development of expertise
Hmm.
but almost nothing on how does development look once you're at that level.
Hmm.
It makes sense that, Ronaldo is at the point in his career when he's going to be thinking about maintenance of performance and declines in performance. And
Hmm.
what does that phase of development actually look like? What do you need to do psychologically to make sure that that player maintains his time at the top?
Hmm.
Nobody's asking those kinds of questions.
Yeah, and they're super interesting questions because, um, eh, yeah, like you said, oftentimes it's once we get them there, right? Like I've had people on this podcast who, broke into the first team at Manchester United at 17 years old, and all of a sudden you go from, watching Ryan Giggs and David Beckham on TV to practicing against them. Do
Mhm.
I go in for the tackle? Do
Yeah.
I take players on? What do I do in that situation? And he's like, no one prepared us for that, the psychology of coming into a locker room. I'm a boy, they're men. I'm trying to take someone's spot,
Mhm.
right? And they are not necessarily going to be nice to me. How do I cope with that? How do I cope with getting yelled at by my hero?
Think about the psychological gymnastics that's occurring
Yeah.
during that point, and then now as a team that spent massive amounts of money to put that player in that position,
Hmm.
what structures do you need to surround that person with to support their continued development while
Right.
not undermining the development of Beckham and those guys at the end of their careers?
Right.
It's so exciting to think about the research questions that we could be asking in that space because it's a wide open canvas. No one's really explored those kinds of potential questions.
And what could we invest in? Maybe Ronaldo's not the best example because of his stature in sport,
Yeah.
but we certainly have plenty of examples of senior pros who are 32, 33, who have a lot to offer to teach the young rookie.
Mhm.
Um, what if we invest in them of, hey, you are here and you're going to teach, and this person's going to take your spot? Well, I have to invest in that person's, their sense of identity because they're
Yep.
moving out of their sport. I have to give them the skills to do that, not just say, hey, Joe, go teach the rookie today.
And you got to manage that against expectations of agents and all those extra elements that play a role at the professional level that we don't see thankfully we don't see at the youth level yet.
Yeah.
I think it's such a complicated web, and the teams that we work with are receptive to this because the evidence about forecasting after the draft in major North American sports is that our forecasts are so poor. And one of the possible explanations is that we're just not good at forecasting. The other one, which is the one we're trying to manage, is we're not good at developing after they've been drafted. And so if we can understand that process of development better, then maybe we could look at players at the twilight of their career and say, yeah, you know what, you're not going to play full time next year, and we're potentially going to cut you from the system, or you can play 25% of the time and take 75% of a role of mentoring these junior players, because I think they'd have a lot to learn from you.
Yeah.
Different strategy of using those players, but maybe a better way to manage that sort of exit from the pro career.
And also easier to manage that from someone who's been with the team for 12 years versus someone who just got traded there and they're on their
Yeah.
fifth team and have no loyalty to the development system either.
Yeah, sure. It's not going to work for everyone, but for that small proportion of players that you see that value, and some of them are not going to be good mentors, but there's a certain proportion of them that are real losses to the system when they're gone.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Pivoting back to youth, you have a great chapter of will we ever see another Dave Winfield? And
Mm.
being a Yankee fan, I of course know who Dave Winfield is, and I thought it was funny in the book how he's remembered for his time there and for killing a seagull in
Yeah.
Toronto, and so I do remember that as well. Um, but this idea of Dave Winfield, explain who he is, what he did, and why we don't know that we'll ever see another.
Dave Winfield, I think, is up there with one of my most impressive athletes ever, because he's the only person to be drafted into 4 sports. And the most amazing thing about Dave Winfield is he was drafted to play in the NFL without ever having played organized and structured football
Hmm.
in his life, which is just amazing and speaks to what the scouts saw in him as an athlete. That
Hmm.
imagine being drafted to a sport where they never even saw you play that sport. The magic about Dave Winfield is he had this talent that was allowed to develop and potentially emerge into all these different activities. And the reason I titled the chapter "Will We Ever See Another Dave Winfield?" is I think we've created a sports system that makes those kinds of athletes almost impossible to emerge now, to
Hmm.
develop now, because we structure sport so early and so it's there's year-long sport now for almost every development league. They don't want you to play a different sport in the off season. Well, when you do that, maybe you're increasing the likelihood of somebody succeeding in your sport, maybe not. But what you're definitely doing is eliminating them from possibilities in any other sport. And so that's why I think we've made it much more difficult for athletes like Dave Winfield to emerge. I'm reading Bo Jackson's biography that just came out a couple weeks ago, and it's phenomenal. I think those kinds of athletes could emerge in the 1980s and early 90s. I think it's almost impossible for them to emerge now.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point, and we've talked on the podcast about this work and this idea of specialization. You've certainly nuanced my view of it, right? Where it was easy to say, multi-sport evidence is clear, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But is that the reality economically, commitment wise, all that? Where it's sort of nuanced for me is that even, I mean, first of all. Um, just because it's common doesn't mean it's good, right? Just
Right.
because the system now says one sport from a very young age doesn't mean that that system is designed to best serve the interest of a child. We,
Right.
I think we can agree that it doesn't, right? It's not it's set up to serve the interest of that business. So I don't really care if any of these kids make the NHL. I do care that I pay the mortgage on my ice rink,
Right.
and so there's that piece of it that I think is critical. And so my nuance has been to say to parents, if your child doesn't by choice or by circumstance have a multi-sport experience, he or she certainly needs a multi-movement experience.
Yeah.
And so maybe elaborate on that, because this, I mean, I think this goes into, right, Dave Winfield was a talented athlete who could have been good at whatever he did, and he chose basketball and baseball, but he could have done a lot of things.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of moving parts to that whole equation. And one is the way that sport has changed from being something that you did in an unstructured way after school with your friends to being something that was super structured, cost money, that your parents had to take you to. Just that in itself could prevent the emergence of some people that could be phenomenal natural athletes, because now sport is something that's structured. It costs money, and so well, anybody that can't afford or can't be put into that kind of system is going to be lost. Um, I think I think the athletes have changed as well. The Tiger Woods example that we started the show with, if we understood what helped Tiger become Tiger, then that tells us what a golfer that developed in the 1980s needed during his early development. That doesn't mean that golfers developing in 2022 need the same things. And if anything, the world has changed in profound ways for kids that are growing up now. And so for us, that early specialization question is such an important one, because I think we've created a sports system where the early specialized athlete is much easier to navigate through that system.
Mm.
And at the end of it, we'll get people that make it to the Olympics or to the pro game, and it'll look like specialization was a good pathway, but it doesn't reflect that. It reflects the survivors of that pathway.
Hmm.
And so again, it comes back to this effectiveness efficiency argument that, yeah, you can describe the survivors of your pathway, but that tells you nothing about how efficient it is at creating high performance athletes.
Hmm.
Our our goal in our lab, and it's maybe a bit of a bold one, is to try to understand human development better so that we could look at any question to do with athlete development and say, well, humans develop in a certain trajectory, and this is what a 7-year-old needs to optimize their learning and development at this age. It'll change the way that we think about specialization and practice. We might have soccer programs that focus on multiple movement strategies at 7 in soccer because they know that that's what elite soccer players need. And we're going to
Mhm.
have a more efficient system if we design a program with that in mind.
Mhm. Oh, for sure. And I think that's the thing I try to get. I always use the example because then parents say, "But my kid only wants soccer. My kid
Yeah,
only wants insert sport, right?" And I said, "Yeah, and I bet you your 7-year-old only wants pizza."
right.
But you as the adult know, yeah, you gotta have some broccoli, and so
Yeah.
movements is broccoli, right? And movement doesn't have to be for organized sports. It can be riding your bike with your friends. It can be jumping on the trampoline in your backyard. There's a whole lots of ways to get movement that you don't have to pay someone to do.
And it could be physical education classes, right? Like
Yeah.
if we had higher quality physical and movement education in the school system, then a lot of these problems would solve themselves, and we'd have everybody with a good broad base of fundamental movement and physical literacy skills. The problem comes when we only have one way of delivering those skills, and that's the sports system, and it's becoming, increasingly more specialized as decades have gone on.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, the physical education system in the states is a state by state and district by district decision. So there's
Mhm.
certainly no national standard. Where I live, there's zero requirement for PE for elementary school kids.
Wow.
And then they require daily PE when they get to middle school. So they take kids, they don't teach them to move for 11 years. And then at
Yeah.
the most self conscious time of their life, they say, now go move every day in front of all your peers and play sports that you're not good at. And yeah, and who's the survivors? The kids who were in the outside the school system who can
Yeah.
move. And then we just, call the other, well, they're just not athletes. It's like, but yeah, I mean, it's physical education and movement education. The way you said that is perfect. And if we educated people to move, like we educate them in the fundamentals of math and writing and reading,
Mhm.
boy, we'd really do our society a huge favor, wouldn't we?
Well, and the system that you're describing just seems like a recipe for disaster, right? Because and it's been interesting, the countries that I've been in the last couple of months, the universal phenomenon that they all struggle with is this disengagement from sport and physical activity that occurs between 11 and 13. And this seems
Mhm.
to be a universal phenomenon across the world, which means it's a human development phenomenon. And so if you're initiating physical education classes at the point when people are disengaging from sport and physical activity, you're probably setting up a system that's got nowhere to go but down.
Mhm.
And so it's interesting. We've done a little bit of work with some countries where they don't have organized physical education in the primary or secondary school systems, and then they try to put in place a talent identification program, and the people don't even know how to move. They don't know how to
Mhm.
jump. They don't know how to run. Like these basic sort of fundamental motor development skills, they never develop them. And the windows, if it's not closed, it's not open very much.
Yeah.
And so they have a huge problem trying to develop those things after the fact.
Mhm. Let me throw one more thing from your book, which is that I just threw on some of these kids as non-athletes or non-athletic. There's this idea of labels, right? And you
Mm,
have a whole chapter on label. And when we label a child talented or not talented at a very young age, that can have a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? That's the Matthew effect, right? The rich get richer.
this is one of the areas that we're planning to move into with a lot of our research in the next probably 5 to 10 years. Is just the power of those labels, because it was amazing to me how little we actually know about calling a kid talented or gifted, or the flip side, saying that you're not talented. And the way that we think about talent, and I think most people, this is how they use that word, is as a fixed capacity and a kind of a personal evaluation of your potential in an area. And most of the time in sport, it's an area that you care about. So the potential is for some really damaging psychological effects, but we have no idea how big, how profound. There's a couple of studies in gifted education that suggest that when you tell one child they're gifted, it has a negative effect on the other kids in the family. It's got to make sense that you're going to undermine social relationships on a sports team when you say, you know what, you're the talented group and you're not. I think there's a lot of really interesting research questions there. The other side of that equation is another phenomenon that we seem to be dealing with at the junior level, which is telling kids that that they're talented. And you're on the junior national team. A number of coaches have said, well, the issue that we're dealing with there is they stop working hard
Yeah.
because they're told they're talented, and that actually undermines their capacity for hard work. And so I don't know how we balance that. Well, I do. Don't make the distinction, but again, that's not realistic in a sports system that has limited resources.
Hmm.
And so that's, for me, that's going to be the big research question for us over the next half decade or so.
Especially when you slap the "you're talented" label on a kid who's 7 or 8, right?
Yeah,
And then what you're really saying is, oh, you happen to be born in January, you're bigger, stronger,
right.
faster than everyone. So you're missing all the psychological qualities of talent. And you just happen to be, physically more developed, maturity more developed. What's that get you when everyone catches up, right? Because now you're not developing the work ethic
Hmm.
that's there. And it's interesting. I mean, I've listened to the head of Manchester United's academy talking about, parents being upset when they go and drive to a game and their kid doesn't get in. And he said, from my perspective, right, I'm developing someone to make a debut in front of 75,000 people. And guess what?
Yeah.
They're probably not going to get in. So learning how to go sit on the bench and be disappointed is part of your development as well. It's not always just about playing.
And that seems like a switched on coach
Yeah.
that has broken down the requirements of the high performance lifestyle beyond just performance on the pitch, right? Like
Yeah.
how do you get this person with the coping skills to sit on the bench and not play a minute of this game that he's trained his whole life for? That's a really unique skill set. So I think that's a really switched on comment.
Yeah, for sure. And then again, that kid who's big, strong, fast, okay, he or she plays up because now you're not big, strong, fast anymore.
Mm,
So, what did that game teach you about your ability and the things that you need to develop? Um, and when we move you back down, you can get away with it, or should we not? But then it's like in talent development, right? If I only play that kid up, well, then psychologically I used to be good because that's how
yeah.
they judge. I used to, now all of a sudden I suck instead of all of a sudden I'm playing against everyone who's 2 years older.
Well, and it's probably you try to do both, right? You
Hmm.
you try to make sure they have a balance of experience where they're the star of the show and where they're on the high end of the learning continuum, and not try to do one or the other. And I think for me, that would be a much more defendable approach. What I would do if, and it's interesting, we talked about this when I was in Singapore a couple weeks ago, is remove the word talent from any of our athlete development documents, because I
Mm,
think there's too much baggage that comes along with that word.
mm,
It's inconsistently used and inconsistently understood. I don't think it's good for athletes to be hearing it and thinking about themselves relative to their peers. If we talk to coaches and said, you're not doing an athlete selection, or you're not doing a talent selection exercise here, you're doing an athlete selection. It just, that subtle word change changes the way that they perceive that whole exercise.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I'm just writing this down because I think that's such, I mean, words matter.
Yeah,
Words
for sure.
matter. Again, you did a whole chapter on labels, and words matter. And a word that tells me I made it when I'm 7. I mean,
Yeah.
probably my least favorite word that I rant about is the word elite. Right? There's no,
Yeah.
there's no elite. Maybe in gymnastics you can be an elite 12-year-old, but that's probably it, right? You're not an elite, 12-year-old soccer player, because if you were, you'd be playing in the World Cup right now, but you're not.
Yeah, and maybe there's a whole separate discussion on whether we should have elite 12-year-old gymnasts at the same time. But
Amen.
it's funny because just a couple days ago on Twitter we had this discussion of whether we should be using that word elite, and almost overwhelmingly the social media community came down and said no, we shouldn't be.
Yeah.
And if we're using it as a way of describing people in a normal distribution, then okay, that's a measurement thing. Then maybe that's elite. But
Mhm.
it does more harm than good when you use it when you're talking about kids that are at the start point, or maybe a little bit in their developmental pathway. And we
Yep.
got to pay attention to those kinds of things, because we're working on a project right now to develop basic principles for athlete development, and number one is don't do anything that's going to undermine your athlete's long-term engagement in the pathway.
Mhm.
And if you start using language in the wrong way, or you don't pay attention to basic needs or motivation that they have, you don't provide them with environments that are optimized for their needs and their learning requirements, you're compromising the likelihood of long-term success. And that's the goal of early development, is increasing somebody's potential to be there for the long term.
Right. And I mean, the only one who doesn't get better is the one who doesn't show up tomorrow. So,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, first, as they say in medicine, first do no harm, right?
Right.
Like, get them to come back.
Yeah, and it almost comes full circle back to our deliberate practice stuff, that it lets you overuse the 10,000 hours cliche, but if that's the end point, anything you do that compromises the person's interest in doing that, you've messed up the whole process.
And then, I mean, when it finally comes down to, if everything is right, there's still this pesky thing called luck,
Yes.
right? That I didn't get injured at the wrong time. I happened to cross paths with this coach who moved into town at the right time. Like all these
Yeah.
different things that, like,
Yeah.
that's just, I mean, that's just luck. It's just luck.
Yeah, and we talk about that a little bit in the book as well. The examples from one of our friends that works for a professional club in the Premier League in the UK, of players in their academy system that didn't get the memo and showed up for the travel team when he wasn't on the team, and they just said, "Well, you're here, just come along," and ends up with a pro contract in the Premier League. Like, these things are everywhere around us,
Yeah.
and we don't really understand that role of random chance and luck, and even biological randomness. This is what makes talent identification and athlete development such a complicated thing, is there's so many more ways it can go wrong than for it to go right.
And it's I mean, so complex. I wrote down a quote from sort of your, at the end of the book, you, as you call, redefining youth sport. And then I'm just realizing as I'm trying to read it how bad my handwriting is. When we conceptualize talent as a generally fixed capacity needing to be identified and then nurtured in an optimized environment to ensure it reaches its potential, we do a disservice to the complexity. And that really sums up the book right there, doesn't it? That this thing is so complex.
Yeah, it does. That's a nice, I actually really like that
Do
sentence.
you write that sentence? Yeah,
I
good
did.
job.
Yeah. Yeah. It wasn't one of those AI bots that's coming out. No, that was 100% Baker right there. Um, but I like it because the complexity is not just in the individual development, it's in the coach's approach to the athlete, it's the parents, it's the luck of the system that person was born into. It's all of those things that make this such a monstrously complicated thing that we're trying to figure out,
Mhm.
which makes it, the futility of trying to predict it, I think, is important, but that doesn't mean we can't design better environments for people to thrive. I think
Mhm.
that's the takeaway for me is, hey, we should be trying to limit how much we try to predict a person's development, and provide them with the tools and the environment to help facilitate that learning.
And so then it eventually just probably comes back to, right, is not my quote, as many as possible, as long as possible, best environment possible, and stop trying to predict and
Yeah.
just look at what's in front of you and what's happening.
What does the person who's right in front of you at this moment need in order to thrive?
Yeah. Excellent. Joe, this was a great talk. The hour flew by. Any other points, any final thoughts you want to leave the readers with? And then please, how do people find this book and connect with your work?
Yeah, I think so. This was a fun book to write. It's a different book than the other dozen that we've done, which have been more to a scholarly audience, researchers, that kind of stuff. This one I wrote for coaches and for practitioners, so I'm open to feedback. It's I liked writing it. I'm going to write more in this kind of style, so I'd love feedback from anybody who reads it. It's available on Amazon at the moment. I created my own publishing company to publish this because I wanted to keep the price point low. So it wasn't $100 book that coaches had to buy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where you can find it. Any questions, any feedback, I'm on Twitter at bakerj yorku. I'm also at, if you search for Joe Baker, York University, you'll come up with my website. Always happy to have a chat with coaches with problems. That's why I do what I do. And I never regret any of the conversations I've had. So yeah, if you're struggling with anything, just reach out.
Brilliant. Let me ask one final little piece.
Sure.
Of the feedback you've gotten so far, what have you been harassed about the most?
That there's no solutions for coaches. There's
Mm,
lots of questions, there's lots of problems. And even though I have a whole section at the end called on solutions, it doesn't actually tell coaches in a tangible way what they can do. And I think that's true. And that's the complexity that we're dealing with, is that there isn't a single solution. There's 1,000 solutions for 1,000 different athletes. And that's the art of coaching, is figuring out what's the one that I need to put in practice right now.
Well, I think that's why it's such a great book, because most of these books that have told us the solution have ended up being wrong,
Yeah.
or not nuanced enough, and then we try to squeeze everyone into that solution and wonder why most people don't fit. And so this is why this book leaves it open to who's in front of me, what do they need, and how can I best deliver it. And I think that's talent development in a nutshell.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, we should always be wary of people that think they have a single solution for something as complex as us.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Joe, thanks for being on the Way Champions again.
Yeah, my pleasure. Looking forward to the next time.